My grandfather's cabin, nestled deep in the woods, used to be my favourite escape. But then, things started happening. Unexplained noises, objects moving on their own. I quickly realised we weren't alone. You won't believe who or what started showing up. The screen door to my grandfather's cabin is the sound of my childhood. A long, mournful scream, followed by a sharp thwack against the frame. It was the sound of summer, of escape, of safety. The cabin itself wasn't much, just a single A-frame structure built from rough-hewn pine logs that Grandpa had felled and stripped himself back in the 50s. It sat on the shore of Lake Pennaquin, a deep, dark sliver of water nestled in the thick woods of western Maine. A good 20 miles from the nearest town, and another 5 down a dirt road that was more suggestion than thoroughfare. Inside, it smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and the faint, sweet aroma of the pipe tobacco that Grandpa used to smoke. The furniture was a collection of comfortable, sagging rejects from my grandparents' primary home. A floral print couch that had swallowed more than its fair share of loose change, a set of mismatched armchairs, and a big, scarred oak table where we'd played 1,000 hands of gin rummy and eaten twice as many blueberry pancakes. Family photographs, curled and faded by the sun, were tacked to every available surface. A gallery of smiling ghosts from summers past. My sister Sarah and I spent every July there, running wild in the woods, swimming until our skin pruned, and listening to Grandpa's stories by the crackling fire pit as the loons called their lonely, echoing cries across the water. It was our sanctuary, a place stitched together with happy memories, utterly insulated from the anxieties of the outside world. I don't know when the feeling started to change. It wasn't a sudden shift, more like the slow, creeping chill of an autumn evening that you don't notice until you're shivering. Grandpa had been gone for 5 years by then, and the cabin had passed to my father. We still went, of course. We went to keep the memories alive, to feel his presence in the creak of the floorboards and the way the morning sun slanted through the dusty windows. But something was off. It started subtly. I was maybe 16, Sarah 13. We were up for a long weekend in October, the woods ablaze in a riot of red and gold. I was reading on the couch when I heard something, an unusual but distinctive tapping sound coming from the loft upstairs, where Sarah and I slept. "Sarah, cut it out," I called, not looking up from my book. The tapping stopped. A moment later, I heard the scree thwack of the screen door. It was Sarah coming in from the porch. "Cut what out?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "The tapping, weren't you just upstairs?" She shook her head, her blonde ponytail swinging. "I've been on the dock skipping stones for the last hour." My blood went cold for a second. A quick, icy little trickle down my spine. But then, rationalization, that warm blanket of denial, wrapped itself around me. A branch against the roof, a squirrel, an old house settling. There were hundreds of logical explanations, and I grabbed the nearest one, like a drowning man grabs a life preserver. That was the first whisper. The incidents that followed were just as small, just as easily dismissed. Each one a tiny crack in the foundation of our comfort. Dad's favourite fishing lure, a silver spoon he swore was magic, went missing from the tackle box on the porch, only to turn up a week later inside the sugar bowl in the kitchen cupboard. Mum lost her reading glasses, and we found them balanced precariously on top of the mounted deer head over the fireplace, a place she couldn't possibly have reached. We blamed each other, blamed our faulty memories. It was easier. Even my dad, the bedrock of practicality in our family, had an experience he couldn't explain away, though he certainly tried. He was tinkering with the outboard motor on the boat, a yearly ritual of cursing and scraped knuckles. He needed a specific socket wrench and laid it on the edge of the dock right beside him. He turned to grab a rag, and when he turned back, the wrench was gone. He was furious, convinced I'd been messing around and misplaced it. We had a brief, heated argument before he stomped off to the shed to find a replacement. Later that afternoon, as Mum was putting away groceries, she let out a little shriek. The wrench was inside a brand new, factory-sealed box of cereal. Dad just stared at it, his face pale, his jaw working silently. "Must have fallen in at the factory," he muttered. The explanation so flimsy, it was almost comical. He refused to speak of it again. The sounds became more frequent. The weird tapping evolved into what sounded like footsteps, a cumbersome shuffle from the loft in the dead of night. Sometimes we'd hear a faint, dry whisper, like the rustle of dead leaves, that would cease the moment we strained to listen. We'd lie in our beds, Sarah and I, eyes wide in the dark, communicating our shared fear through the tense silence. During the day, in the bright, reassuring sunlight, it all seemed foolish. But when night fell, the cabin seemed to shrink, the vast, dark woods pressing in, and the world outside our small circle of lamplight felt alien and threatening. The feeling of being watched was the worst. It would come on suddenly. You could be washing dishes, staring out of the window at the placid lake, and the hairs on the back of your neck would prickle with an undeniable certainty that a pair of eyes was fixed on you. You'd spin around to find nothing but the familiar, empty room. It was a constant feeling of anxiety that began to erode the cabin's peaceful charm, replacing it with a quiet, gnawing dread. We stopped talking about it, as if giving voice to the fear would make it more real. We just lived with it, a silent, unspoken agreement to pretend that our sanctuary wasn't slowly becoming a cage. The summer I turned 18 was the summer the whispers learned to scream. It was the first time my cousin, Mark, had come to stay with us since we were little kids. Mark was a city kid, loud and skeptical, and his presence felt like a shield against the creeping weirdness of the cabin. For the first few days, everything was normal. We swam, we fished, we told jokes around the fire. The cabin felt like its old self again. The fourth night, we were all sitting at the big oak table, playing poker for matchsticks. Dad had a small radio on, the signal crackling, a baseball game fading in and out. Suddenly, the radio went dead silent. Not just white noise, but pure, dead air. Dad fiddled with a knob, grumbling about the reception. As he turned the dial, a new sound bled through the speakers. It wasn't music. It was a voice, a woman's, humming a lullaby. It was a simple, old-fashioned tune, but the sound was thin and wavering, filled with an ancient, bone-deep sorrow that made the air in the room feel heavy and cold. "What the hell is that?" Mark asked, his bravado gone, his face pale in the lantern light. Dad smacked the side of the radio. The humming stopped, replaced by the familiar crackle of the ball game. He laughed, a little too loud, a little too forced. "Old radio, picks up strange signals out here." But none of us believed him. We'd all heard it, clear as a bell. We'd all felt that wave of profound sadness wash over us. The poker game ended soon after that. Later that night, I was jolted awake by a scream. It was Sarah. I sat bolt upright, my heart trying to punch its way out of my chest. In the faint moonlight filtering through the loft window, I could see her sitting up in her own bed across the room. Her body rigid, a hand clamped over her mouth. What is it?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just pointed a shaking finger towards the foot of my bed. I followed her gaze, my eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. And then I saw it. It was a shadow, but it was wrong somehow. It was darker than the other shadows in the room. A patch of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the moonlight. It was vaguely human-shaped, tall and impossibly thin, with stretched, gangling limbs. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, observing. I couldn't see a face, but I could feel its attention. A cold and malevolent stare that cut through me like a hot knife through butter. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. My entire body was paralyzed by a fear so pure and primal, it felt like a physical blow. The shadow stood there for what felt like an eternity. A silent, black monolith of terror. Then, with a slow, fluid motion that was utterly unnatural, it seemed to fold in on itself and seep into the floorboards, vanishing as if it had never been there. The moment it was gone, Sarah and I both gasped for air, our screams finally finding purchase. Dad came thundering up the ladder a moment later, a flashlight in one hand and a fireplace poker in the other. We told him what we saw, our words tumbling over each other in a hysterical rush. He swept the flashlight beam around the empty loft, his face a mask of worry and disbelief. He found nothing, of course. He told us it was a nightmare, a shared dream brought on by that weird radio signal. Mark, who'd woken up during the commotion, didn't say a word. He just packed his bags the next morning. I found him on the porch, smoking one of my dad's cigarettes with shaking hands. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. He told me he was leaving, making up a flimsy excuse about a summer league baseball practice. But I pressed him to tell the truth. He did, finally. "It wasn't just the shadow," he said, his voice barely a whisper, refusing to meet my eyes. "After you girls screamed and your dad came up, when it got quiet again, I heard something. From that corner where the shadow was. A voice. It sounded like it was 1,000,000 years old. It just said one word, over and over. It said, more." He never came back to the cabin again. That was the turning point. The pretense was over. We couldn't deny it anymore. There was something in the cabin with us. something old and unseen. The place that had been our refuge was now the source of a deep and abiding fear. We started trying to understand it, to put a name to the thing that was haunting our memories. Dad, ever the pragmatist, initially clung to logical explanations. Carbon monoxide leaks causing hallucinations, infrasound from wind patterns over the lake. He even had the place inspected. They found nothing. Mum, who'd always been more spiritual, leaned towards the paranormal. She thought it might be Grandpa trying to communicate with us. But the feeling we got from these presences, it wasn't Grandpa. There was no warmth, no love. There was just a cold, hollow emptiness. A sense of longing mixed with something that felt disturbingly like resentment. My own research started at the tiny, musty library in the nearest town, Bridgerton. The librarian was a woman named Mrs. Jones, who looked as if she'd been shelved there since the turn of the century. When I told her where our cabin was, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps pity, crossed her face. "Pennaquid Lake," she said, her voice a dry rustle. "Not many year-rounders out there anymore. That point of land, it has a history." I asked her if she knew of any local legends. She hesitated, peering at me over her spectacles. "Some places are like spoiled meat, dear. They just go bad. People have tried to live out there before your grandfather. None of them stayed long. They'd leave in a hurry, talking about bad luck, a chill that got into their bones and never left, a feeling of being unwelcome." She finally led me to a back room filled with uncatalogued town records and pulled out a large leather-bound ledger labelled Bridgerton County, 1880 to 1910. "There was a family that had a homestead out on that point of land, long before your grandfather built his place," she said, her finger tracing a line on a hand-drawn map. "The Winters family, Jebediah and Elspeth. They had 4 children." She flipped through the brittle pages. "They were reclusive, trappers, didn't come into town much. One year they just stopped coming." She found the page she was looking for. The entry was dated March 1894. A town constable had been sent to check on them after the spring thaw. His report was brief and chillingly detailed. I read his spidery handwriting. The homestead was snowed in, the door barred from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of anyone having left. The family's meagre supplies were completely gone. The flour barrels scraped clean, as if by desperate fingers. Not a crumb of sustenance remained. The cabin was empty. The family, Jebediah, Elspeth and their 4 small children, had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The official story was that they must have tried to walk out during a blizzard and got lost, Mrs. Jones said softly. But no one ever found a body. Not a single one. She lowered her voice. "The old stories, the one the loggers used to tell. They said the family was still out there. That the hunger of that last winter had changed them, made them something else. They called them the silent guests because they'd sometimes show up in the camps. Just shadows at the edge of the firelight, watching the men eat, never making a sound." A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Everything that we'd seen, everything that I'd been told, it all clicked into place with a terrifying, sickening certainty. These things were once human, but now they clearly weren't. Hunger had changed them into something else entirely. That was the last summer any of us stayed at the cabin. The thought of them was too much to bear. A starving family, trapped forever in the place where they'd wasted away. Drawn to the life and warmth of our family, to the smell of our food, the sound of our laughter. They weren't evil, not in the way you think of demons or poltergeists. They were just echoes of a desperate, primal need. They were the guests who'd arrived in the winter of 1894 and had never been able to leave. They resented us for our warmth, for our full bellies, for the life we took for granted. And they wanted what we had. They wanted to sit at our table, to sleep in our beds, to be part of the happy family in the photographs on the wall. But their touch was the lingering cold of starvation. Their presence a constant, draining siphon on the joy we tried to feel there. They were trying to feed on our memories, on our happiness, to fill the cold, empty void inside them. The cabin still stands on the shore of Lake Pennaquin, silent and empty. Dad pays the taxes, but can't bring himself to sell it. Who would he sell it to? And what would he tell them? He can't bear to tear it down either. It feels like desecrating a grave. The experience changed us in quiet ways. We don't go on long family trips anymore. There's an unspoken tension, a shared trauma that we never acknowledge. Like a piece of furniture in a familiar room that everyone pretends not to see. Sometimes, late at night, I pull out the old photo albums. There's one picture I always come back to. It was taken on my 10th birthday, on the cabin's porch. Grandpa's there, smiling, his arm around me. Mum, Dad and Sarah are all laughing. It's a perfect snapshot of a perfect memory. But a few years ago, I was looking at it under a magnifying glass, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. In the dark reflection of the window behind us, just visible over my father's shoulder, is a face. It's pale and gaunt, little more than a skull, stretched with thin, grey skin. Its eyes are wide, dark pools of emptiness, and its mouth is open, as if in a silent, unending scream of hunger. A silent guest, wanting to be part of the family, forever.